Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I'd love to know. Share it in the comments along with how you liked the story. I reply to every single one of you. Now let's step into the mystery. In the shadowy hamlet of Lower Wycombe, where secrets fester beneath the roses, Miss Jane Marple unravels a chilling mystery. Eleanor Price, a beautiful widow with 3 dead husbands, pleads for help, claiming she's hunted. But whispers of poison, a grave-like patch by an old well, and a locked shed hiding a gruesome truth point to a darker plot. As midnight shadows reveal buried secrets and a groundskeeper's betrayal, Marple's keen eye stitches together a tale of charm, deceit, and murder, where the widow's tears mask a deadly design. Will the truth stay buried, or will Marple unravel it before another life is lost? Chapter 1. The Whisper in Chipping Cleghorn. The village of Chipping Cleghorn lay nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the amber glow of an autumn afternoon. The air carried the crisp bite of October, mingled with the faint sweetness of wood smoke and late-blooming honeysuckle. At Little Paddocks, the charming home of Miss Letitia Blacklock, Miss Jane Marple sat in a chintz-covered armchair by the parlour window, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. Her delicate hands, deceptively frail, worked a soft blue wool, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. Not the flutter of a sparrow in the garden, nor the subtle shift in the village's pulse. Miss Marple had come to Chipping Cleghorn at Letitia's insistence, a respite from her usual haunts, though she suspected her friend's invitation held an ulterior motive. Letitia, a woman of practical cheer, had hinted at something odd afoot in the nearby hamlet of Lower Wycombe. But it was not until the morning's post arrived that the vague unease crystallized into something more tangible. The letter, delivered by a breathless postman, was penned in a hurried, almost frantic hand. It bore the crest of Wycombe Hall, a Gothic estate in Lower Wycombe, and was signed by Mrs. Eleanor Price, a widow whose name stirred whispers even in Chipping Cleghorn's tea-rooms. Eleanor was a figure of fascination, raven-haired, strikingly beautiful, and trailed by a shadow of tragedy. 3 husbands, each wealthy, each dead within a year of their marriage, had left her both rich and reviled. The official verdicts, heart failure, a cliffside fall, a sudden fever, did little to quell the rumours that swirled like mist over the moors. Poison, some said. Others spoke of a curse. A few, in hushed tones, suggested something darker still. Eleanor's letter was a plea, its words trembling with fear. She wrote of sleepless nights, of footsteps echoing in the empty corridors of Wycombe Hall, of shadows that lingered too long in the orchard. "I am watched, Miss Marple," she wrote, "and I fear for my life. Your name was mentioned by a mutual acquaintance as one who sees what others miss. Please come to Lower Wycombe. I trust no one else." The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. Miss Marple set the letter on the lace-covered table. Her knitting paused. She gazed out at the garden, where Letitia was fussing over a rosebush, and considered the matter. Eleanor Price was no ordinary widow. Her beauty, her wealth, her string of dead husbands, they formed a pattern, and Miss Marple had a particular fondness for patterns. They were like the stitches in her knitting, each one small, unremarkable, but together revealing a design only the observant could discern. She recalled a case from her youth. A young bride in a neighbouring village whose suitors vanished until a keen-eyed doctor noticed the faint scent of bitter almonds. patterns, Miss Marple thought, always led to truth. Letitia bustled in, her cheeks flushed from the garden. "Jane, you're awfully quiet. What's that letter about?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "A matter of some urgency, I believe. A Mrs. Eleanor Price from Lower Wycombe has asked for my help." Letitia's eyes widened. Eleanor Price, the Black Widow they call her. 3 husbands gone, and not a tear shed, if you believe the gossip. What does she want with you? "She claims she's in danger," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her mind sharp. "I think I shall pay her a visit." Letitia gasped, half in delight, half in alarm. "Jane, you can't mean to get mixed up with her. They say she's, well, not quite right. Dangerous, even." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear Letitia, the dangerous ones are often the most interesting, and fear, you know, can be a mask for many things." She rose, folding her knitting with care, and made arrangements to travel to Lower Wycombe the next day. As she prepared for bed that evening, the letter lay on her nightstand, its words echoing in her mind. A woman afraid, or a woman playing at fear. Miss Marple knew the difference was often a matter of a single thread, waiting to be pulled. And pull it she would. Chapter 2. The Widow's Estate. The road to Lower Wycombe wound through rolling hills, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over hedgerows and stone walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the back of a hired car, watched the countryside glide past, her hands folded neatly over her black handbag. The air was sharp with the promise of an early frost, and the village of Chipping Cleghorn, with its cosy familiarity, already felt a world away. Lower Wycombe, though only a few miles distant, had a different character, wilder, more secretive, as if the very landscape guarded its truths. Wycombe Hall, the Gothic estate of Mrs. Eleanor Price, loomed on the horizon, its spires piercing the sky like the jagged teeth of some ancient beast. Miss Marple alighted at the hall's iron gates, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel drive. The house was a study in contrasts. Its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows suggested old-world charm, but the air held a faint chill, a sense of disquiet that clung like damp mist. The front door swung open before she could knock, revealing Eleanor Price herself. The widow was a vision. Raven hair swept into an elegant chignon, her pale skin luminous against a black silk dress that clung to her slender frame. Her eyes, a striking green, darted nervously, betraying the poise of her greeting. "Miss Marple, you're so kind to come," Eleanor said, her voice low and musical, with a tremor that might have been fear or artifice. "I hardly know where to begin." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene but her gaze keen. "Begin with a cup of tea, perhaps," she suggested, stepping into the cavernous hall. The interior was as grand as expected, with polished oak panelling and a sweeping staircase, but it felt oddly hollow, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Eleanor led her to a parlour where a fire crackled, casting flickering shadows over a collection of portraits on the walls. 3 men, each captured in oils, their eyes seeming to follow the visitor with silent accusation. Over tea served in delicate porcelain cups, Eleanor recounted her fears. She spoke of sleepless nights haunted by strange noises, creaks in the floorboards, a low scraping from the gardens, the distant clink of metal on stone. "Last week," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I found something dreadful. Behind the old well, there's a patch of earth, freshly dug. It's too large for planting, Miss Marple. It looked like a grave." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face betraying nothing, but her mind was already at work. A grave, she thought, was a curious thing to find in one's garden, unless it was meant to be found. She studied Eleanor closely. The widow's beauty was undeniable, her gestures graceful, yet there was a theatrical quality to her distress, a practised elegance that reminded Miss Marple of a young actress she had once known, who wept crocodile tears to mask her guilt. The portraits on the wall only deepened the puzzle. 3 husbands, each handsome, each dead before his time. The first, a merchant named Reginald Vance, had succumbed to a heart attack. The second, an artist called Julian Holt, had fallen from a cliff. The third, Major Frederick Hargreaves, had died of a sudden fever. Natural causes, the coroners said, but village tongues wagged with darker tales. "Tell me about your husbands," Miss Marple said gently, setting her cup down. "They must have been remarkable men." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her saucer, a fleeting shadow crossing her face. "They were dear to me," she said, her voice steady but her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "Reginald was so kind, though his temper could flare. Julian was a dreamer, always sketching the sea. And Frederick, well, he was a soldier, brave but stubborn. Their deaths were tragedies, each one." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite sympathy, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled a case from years past. A widow in a nearby village whose suitors met untimely ends, each death neatly explained until a pattern emerged. Patterns, she knew, were the key to unlocking secrets, and Eleanor Price's life was woven with them. The parlour door creaked open, admitting a maid, a nervous girl named Clara, who set down a plate of scones with trembling hands. Miss Marple noted the girl's unease, the way her eyes flicked toward Eleanor before she scurried out. "Your staff seems anxious," she remarked mildly. Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "Clara's young, easily frightened. The hall is old, full of noises. It unsettles her." Miss Marple let the comment pass, but her mind catalogued it. After tea, Eleanor offered a tour of the grounds, and Miss Marple accepted, her curiosity piqued by the mention of the dug-up earth. The gardens were a labyrinth of overgrown roses and tangled yew hedges, their beauty marred by neglect. The old well, half hidden by brambles, stood at the edge of an orchard, its stone rim moss-covered and crumbling. Nearby, the patch of earth Eleanor had described lay stark against the grass, a rectangle of churned soil, too precise for a casual planting, too deep for a flower bed. "It's unsettling, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her arms crossed tightly. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing." Miss Marple knelt, her gloved fingers brushing the soil. It was loose, freshly turned, with a faint smell of damp earth and something sharper, lime, perhaps, or some chemical meant to hasten decay. She stood, brushing her hands, and noticed a faint path leading from the well to a small shed, its door secured with a gleaming new padlock. "What's kept in there?" she asked, her tone conversational. "Just tools," Eleanor said quickly, her eyes darting away. "Amos, the groundskeeper, stores his things there." Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts were racing. A locked shed, a fresh grave, a nervous maid. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to unravel. As they returned to the hall, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the orchard. A man, tall and lean, half hidden by the trees. He vanished before she could see his face, but the sight lingered, a puzzle piece yet to find its place. Back in the parlour, Eleanor resumed her tale of fear, but Miss Marple was only half listening. Her eyes wandered to the portraits again, noting the details. Reginald's stern jaw, Julian's soulful gaze, Frederick's military posture. Each man had been drawn to Eleanor's charm, and each had paid a price. Was Eleanor the victim she claimed, or the architect of her own drama? Miss Marple knew that fear could be genuine or a mask for guilt, and she intended to find out which. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hall in twilight, Miss Marple resolved to stay in Lower Wickham a little longer. The car would return for her tomorrow, but tonight she would watch and listen. The widow's estate was a stage, and its players were hiding something. Miss Marple's needles would click on, stitching together the truth, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 3. The Groundskeeper's Secret. The morning mist hung low over Lower Wickham, shrouding the gardens of Wickham Hall in a veil of silver. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, stepped out into the crisp air, her eyes bright with purpose. The Gothic silhouette of the hall loomed behind her, its spires softened by the fog. But her attention was fixed on the grounds. The orchard, the well, and the troubling patch of earth that Eleanor Price had described as grave-like. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth often lay in the overlooked corners of a place, in the small details that others dismissed. Today, she meant to explore those corners. The gardens were a wild tangle, their beauty frayed by neglect. Roses, past their prime, drooped heavily, their petals littering the path like faded confetti. Miss Marple moved with deliberate care, her sensible shoes silent on the damp grass, her gaze sweeping the landscape. She paused at the old well, its stone rim slick with moss, and studied the churned earth nearby. The rectangular patch was stark against the surrounding turf, its edges too neat for a casual digging. She knelt, her gloved fingers sifting through the soil, noting its looseness and the faint acrid tang that lingered. Not just earth, but something chemical, perhaps to mask a darker purpose. As she rose, a rustle from the orchard drew her attention. A man emerged from the shadows of the apple trees, his wiry frame clad in a worn tweed jacket. This was Amos Finch, the groundskeeper, his face weathered as the bark he tended, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her. In his hands he carried a rake, its tines crusted with fresh soil. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but her gaze piercing. "You've a fine touch with these gardens. The asters are quite splendid." Finch gave a curt nod, his grip tightening on the rake. "They do well enough, ma'am," he muttered, his eyes flicking toward the well. "Not much call for visitors out here, though." Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "I'm fond of gardens. They tell such interesting stories, don't you think? This patch here, for instance." She gestured to the dug-up earth. "Mrs. Price mentioned it. A new shrub, she said." Finch's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Aye, that's what she told me. Wanted it dug deep for a rose bush. Odd spot, mind. Too shaded, too wet. But she's the mistress, ain't she?" "Deep, you say?" Miss Marple's tone was light, but her mind was sharp, filing away his words. "How deep exactly?" Finch hesitated, his eyes darting to the shed beyond the well, its new padlock glinting faintly in the mist. "Deep enough for roots," he said gruffly, then turned back to his rake, raking leaves with unnecessary vigour. "Got work to do, ma'am." Miss Marple let him go, but her thoughts lingered on his unease, the way his gaze had strayed to the shed. She recalled a gardener from her youth, a quiet man who buried more than bulbs in his employer's garden, secrets that surfaced only when a curious neighbour noticed the earth was turned too often. Patterns, she thought, were like roots themselves, hidden until you knew where to dig. She wandered toward the shed, its weathered wood stark against the greenery. The padlock was indeed new, its metal unscratched, suggesting recent purpose. She tested it gently, but it held firm. A faint sound, perhaps a rustle, perhaps something heavier, came from within, but the mist muffled it, and she could not be sure. She made a mental note to return later, when the grounds were quieter. As she retraced her steps toward the hall, she noticed a side path leading to a small herb garden, its beds overgrown, but still fragrant with lavender and thyme. There, partially hidden by a yew hedge, was a compost heap, its surface disturbed, as if recently added to. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching a glint of something metallic half buried in the pile. A button, perhaps, or a clasp, its sheen out of place among the rotting leaves. She did not touch it, but marked its location, her mind turning over possibilities. A button could be nothing, or it could be a clue, dropped in haste by someone who thought it unseen. Back at the hall, Eleanor was waiting in the parlour, her black silk dress replaced by a deep burgundy gown that made her pale skin glow like porcelain. She was arranging flowers in a vase, but her movements were restless, her fingers plucking petals with unconscious force. "Did you enjoy the gardens, Miss Marple?" she asked, her smile tight. "Very much," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. "They're full of character. Your groundskeeper, Mr. Finch, seems devoted to his work." Eleanor's smile faltered. "Amos is reliable, if a bit rough. He's been here since before my time." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the portraits on the wall. Reginald Vance, Julian Holt, Frederick Hargreaves, their painted gazes as unyielding as ever. "It must be a comfort, having such a steady hand about," she said, "especially with these strange happenings you've mentioned." Eleanor set the vase down with a clink. "Yes, it's unsettling. The noises, the shadows. I feel as if the hall itself is watching me." Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic, but her mind was elsewhere. Eleanor's fear, if genuine, was understandable, but there was a cadence to her words, a rehearsed quality that reminded Miss Marple of a village girl who once spun tales of persecution to hide her own misdeeds. She changed the subject, asking about the history of the hall, and Eleanor obliged with stories of its former owners, her voice steadier now, but Miss Marple noted the widow's glances toward the window, as if expecting someone or something to appear. As they spoke, Clara, the nervous maid, entered with a tray of biscuits, her hands trembling so that the china rattled. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the girl's pale face, the way she avoided Eleanor's gaze. "Thank you, Clara," Eleanor said sharply, and the maid fled, leaving a tense silence. "She's a timid thing," Eleanor remarked, her tone dismissive. "The country air doesn't suit her." Miss Marple murmured agreement, but her thoughts were on Clara's fear, Finch's evasiveness, the locked shed, and the buried button. Each was a fragment, like the pieces of a quilt she had once seen a neighbour stitch together, its pattern clear only when viewed whole. She resolved to speak with Clara later, perhaps in the kitchen where the girl might feel less watched. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple excused herself to rest before lunch, but her mind was far from idle. She stood by her guest-room window, overlooking the orchard, and saw Finch again, this time carrying a spade toward the well. He paused, glanced around, then disappeared behind the shed. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Something was afoot, and she intended to uncover it. The groundskeeper's secret, whatever it was, was a thread in the tapestry of Wickham Hall, and Miss Marple was determined to pull it loose. Chapter 4. The Hamlet's Gossip. The afternoon sun bathed Lower Wickham in a golden haze, softening the edges of its cobbled streets and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, walked purposefully toward the village's heart, where the Bluebell Tea Room stood as a hub of local chatter. The air was fragrant with the scent of freshly baked scones and the faint tang of wood smoke, but Miss Marple's mind was far from the pastoral calm. The troubling discoveries at Wickham Hall, the churned earth by the well, the locked shed, Amos Finch's guarded demeanour, and the metallic glint in the compost heap had sharpened her senses. She knew that villagers, with their eager tongues and long memories, often held the keys to unravelling secrets. Accompanied by Letitia Blacklock, who had insisted on joining her from Chipping Cleghorn, Miss Marple entered the tea-room, its low ceiling and lace curtains exuding a cosy intimacy. The room buzzed with the hum of conversation, which dipped briefly as the patrons noted the newcomers. Mrs. Cutler, the proprieties, a stout woman with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, greeted them with a nod and ushered them to a corner table. The other customers, a mix of farmers' wives, a retired schoolmistress, and a young curate, cast curious glances, their voices lowering to whispers. "Jane, you're stirring up the village already," Letitia murmured, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she adjusted her hat. "They're all wondering what brings you here." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as a matter of habit. "Villages are like tapestries, Letitia. Every thread counts, and the gossip here may weave a pattern we need." Mrs. Cutler approached with a tray of tea and scones, her curiosity barely concealed. "Heard you're staying at Wickham Hall, Miss Marple," she said, pouring tea with practised ease. "With Mrs. Price, no less. Quite a lady, isn't she?" "Quite," Miss Marple replied, her tone neutral, but her eyes inviting more. Mrs. Cutler needed little encouragement. As she bustled about, she shared what the village knew of Eleanor Price, her words laced with the relish of a seasoned storyteller. Eleanor had arrived in Lower Wickham 2 years ago, her beauty and wealth turning heads. Her first husband, Reginald Vance, a merchant with a fortune in textiles, had died of a heart attack after a blazing row, his face purple with rage, or so the doctor said. The second, Julian Holt, a painter with a poet's soul, had tumbled from a cliff near the coast, his body dashed on the rocks below. The third, Major Frederick Hargreaves, had succumbed to a fever after a glass of wine that, according to some, tasted of bitter almonds. "They call her the Black Widow," Mrs. Cutler said, lowering her voice as the curate leaned closer. "3 husbands gone, and her not yet 40. It's not natural, is it?" Letitia gasped, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her needles clicking rhythmically. She recalled a case from her youth. A woman whose lovers vanished until a nosy postmistress noticed a pattern in their letters. Gossip, she knew, was often a distorted mirror, but even distortions held truth. "What do the villagers make of these tragedies?" she asked, her voice mild. Mrs. Cutler leaned in, her eyes gleaming. "Some say she's cursed, doomed to lose her men. Others reckon she's cleverer than that. Too clever, if you catch my meaning. There's talk of poison, or worse. And that groundskeeper of hers, Amos Finch, he's no saint. Seen him skulking about at all hours, digging where no one's looking." The schoolmistress, Miss Harrow, joined the conversation, her thin lips pursed. "I knew Major Hargreaves," she said. "He was a guest lecturer at my school once. A fine man, but he wrote me before his death, worried about his wife's late-night visitors. Said he saw her with a man in the orchard, tall and secretive. Next thing, he's dead." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. A tall man in the orchard. Her mind flashed to the figure she had glimpsed the previous evening, spade in hand, vanishing behind the shed. "Did he describe this man?" she asked. Miss Harrow shook her head. "Only that he had a soldier's bearing, thought it might be someone from the hall's staff, but he wasn't sure." The curate, a nervous young man named Mr. Pelham, chimed in. "I've seen Finch myself, near the church at odd hours. He's always carrying tools, but never seems to be gardening. And that shed by the well, it's locked tighter than the vicar's wine cellar." The room erupted in soft laughter, but Miss Marple's mind was racing. The shed, the tall figure, the Major's letter, they were threads in a tightening web. She sipped her tea, encouraging more stories, and the villagers obliged. A farmer's wife mentioned Clara, the maid, who had grown pale and jumpy since working at the hall. Another spoke of strange deliveries to Wickham Hall, sacks of lime, ordered in bulk, which seemed odd for a garden. Lime, Miss Marple knew, could mask the scent of decay, a fact she had learned from a grim case involving a buried secret. Letitia, her eyes wide, leaned closer. "Jane, this is dreadful. Do you think Eleanor's in danger, or something else?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "People are rarely what they seem, Letitia, but the truth has a way of surfacing, like a seed in spring." As the tea-room chatter continued, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. The villagers' tales painted Eleanor as both victim and villain, a woman whose charm was as dangerous as it was alluring. The mention of Amos Finch, with his soldierly frame and nocturnal habits, echoed the Major's letter and her own sighting. The locked shed, the lime, the maid's fear, they were pieces of a puzzle, each fitting into a larger design. She recalled a village scandal years ago, where a seemingly grieving widow had orchestrated her husband's demise, her tears a mask for calculation. Was Eleanor such a woman, or was she genuinely afraid? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay in the shadows of Wickham Hall. As they left the tea-room, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the village green. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching a figure in the distance. Clara, the maid, hurrying along a lane with a basket, her head bowed as if avoiding notice. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her, perhaps in the privacy of the hall's kitchen. The girl's fear was a clue in itself, and Miss Marple knew that frightened souls often knew more than they dared say. Back at Wickham Hall, Eleanor greeted them with a strange smile, her beauty undimmed but her manner taut. "Did you enjoy the village?" she asked, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "Very much," Miss Marple replied, her eyes resting on Eleanor's face. "Lower Wickham is full of stories." Eleanor's smile flickered, and Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. The hamlet's gossip was a mirror, reflecting truths Eleanor might wish to hide. As the evening settled over the hall, Miss Marple resolved to watch closely, her knitting needles ready to stitch. Do together the secrets of Wickham Hall, one whispered thread at a time. Chapter 5. The Shadow at Midnight. The night enveloped Wickham Hall in a velvet hush, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of ancient timbers settling in the cold. Miss Jane Marple, unable to sleep, sat by the window of her guest room, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the darkened grounds below. The moon, a thin crescent, cast a feeble glow over the orchard and the old well, where the troubling patch of earth lay like a scar on the landscape. The events of the day, the villagers' whispers, Amos Finch's evasiveness, the glint of a button in the compost heap, and Eleanor Price's carefully modulated fear, had woven a tapestry of suspicion in Miss Marple's mind. She knew that secrets, like moths, were drawn to the dark, and tonight she intended to watch for them. At midnight, a movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from the shadows near the well, tall and lean, carrying a spade that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The figure moved with purpose, pausing at the dug-up earth to glance around, then slipped toward the locked shed. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her breath steady. The figure's silhouette suggested a man, his posture rigid, almost military. Amos Finch, perhaps, or the mysterious stranger mentioned in the village gossip. Before she could discern more, he vanished behind the shed, leaving only the rustle of leaves in his wake. Miss Marple donned her shawl and slippers, her movements silent as she crept downstairs. The hall was a maze of shadows, its grandeur muted by the hour. She eased open a side door leading to the gardens, the cold air sharp against her face, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying apples. Guided by memory, she made her way to the well, her steps careful on the uneven path. The night was alive with small sounds, the whisper of wind through the yew hedges, the distant bark of a fox, but the patch of earth was undisturbed, its surface smooth as if freshly raked. Yet Miss Marple's keen eyes caught something new. A set of footprints, deep and deliberate, leading from the well to the shed. They were too large for Eleanor's delicate feet, too purposeful for a casual wanderer. Approaching the shed, she paused, her ears straining. A faint scratching sound came from within. Not the scurry of a rat, but something heavier, more deliberate. She tested the padlock, its cold metal unyielding, and noted a faint smear of dirt on its surface, as if touched by a soil-stained hand. The scratching ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind racing. Something or someone was concealed within, and the locked door suggested it was meant to stay hidden. She retreated to the hall, her thoughts a whirl of possibilities. The figure in the garden, the footprints, the scratching sound, they were pieces of a puzzle, each fitting into a larger design. She recalled a case from her early years, a village carpenter who hid stolen goods in a locked barn, his nocturnal movements betraying him to a watchful neighbour. The shed at Wickham Hall held a secret, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. The next morning, over a breakfast of toast and marmalade, Miss Marple observed Eleanor closely. The widow was pale, her eyes shadowed, as if sleep had eluded her too. She spoke of trivialities, the weather, the state of the roses, but her hands betrayed her, twisting a napkin into knots. Miss Marple, her tone gentle, mentioned the noises of the night. "I thought I heard someone in the garden," she said, watching Eleanor's reaction. "Near the well, perhaps." Eleanor's cup clattered against its saucer. "It must have been Amos," she said quickly, her voice too bright. "He often checks the grounds at night. The orchard attracts poachers." Miss Marple nodded, her face serene, but her mind noting the lie. Eleanor's haste to explain, her avoidance of eye contact, echoed the behaviour of a vicar's wife Miss Marple had once known, who spun tales to cover her husband's indiscretions. She changed the subject, asking to see the hall's cellar, claiming a curiosity about its architecture. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening on the napkin, then agreed with a forced smile. The cellar door was tucked beneath the main staircase, its wood warped with age. Eleanor led the way, a lantern in hand, its flickering light casting eerie shapes on the stone walls. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of earth and a sharper note. Lime, Miss Marple thought, her nose wrinkling. The cellar was vast, its low ceiling supported by rough-hewn beams, its floor a patchwork of flagstones and packed dirt. In one corner, partially hidden by a stack of crates, was a pile of loose soil, covered by a tattered canvas. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, her memory flashing to the lime-scented air of a garden, where a body had been found years ago, its decay masked by careful planning. "For repairs," Eleanor said, her voice brittle as she gestured to the pile. "The cellar floods sometimes. Amos is fixing the drainage." Miss Marple murmured agreement, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Lime was not for drainage, but for concealment, a fact she had learned in a grim case involving a missing farmer. She noted the crates, their labels faded, but suggesting deliveries of gardening supplies. More lime, perhaps, or something equally telling. As they ascended, she caught Eleanor's glance toward the crates, a flicker of unease that did not escape her. Back in the parlour, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles clicking as she pondered. The shadow at midnight, the footprints, the scratching in the shed, the lime-scented cellar, they were threads in a tightening web. Eleanor's fear, whether genuine or staged, was a performance, and Miss Marple suspected the widow was no mere victim. She recalled the village gossip, the tale of Major Hargreaves's letter about a tall man in the orchard, and the curate's mention of Finch's odd hours. Amos Finch, with his soldierly frame and secretive habits, was a likely candidate for the midnight figure. But Miss Marple knew better than to assume too quickly. Villages were full of surprises, and Lower Wickham was no exception. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple resolved to speak with Clara, the maid, whose fear was a clue in itself. She found the girl in the kitchen, peeling potatoes with trembling hands. "Clara, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you seem troubled. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Clara's eyes darted to the door, her voice a whisper. "It's not my place, ma'am. But the hall, it's not right. Things happen at night, things I can't speak of." Miss Marple patted her hand, her tone soothing but her mind alert. "You're safe with me, Clara. Sometimes a word can lift a great weight." But Clara shook her head, her lips pressed tight, and returned to her potatoes. Miss Marple did not press further. Fearful servants, she knew, spoke only when the danger grew too great, or when the truth could no longer be buried. As she left the kitchen, her eyes strayed to the window, where the shed stood in the distance, its padlock a silent challenge. The shadow at midnight had left its mark, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it to the heart of Wickham Hall's secrets. Chapter 6. The Major's Journal. The morning sun broke through the mist over Lower Wickham, casting a pale light on the weathered stones of Wickham Hall. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table, stirred her tea thoughtfully, her serene demeanour belying the whirl of deductions in her mind. The events of the past days, the shadowy figure by the well, the scratching in the locked shed, the lime-scented cellar, and Clara's unspoken fears, had tightened the threads of suspicion around Eleanor Price and her groundskeeper, Amos Finch. Yet Miss Marple knew that intuition alone was not enough. Evidence was needed, and she suspected the key lay not in the hall, but in the past. An opportunity presented itself when Letitia Blacklock, her friend from Chipping Cleghorn, proposed a visit to the village library, a modest building tucked behind the church. Letitia had mentioned a collection of donated books, including some from the estate of Major Frederick Hargreaves, Eleanor's third husband. "They're mostly military histories," Letitia said as they walked the cobbled lane, her voice bright with curiosity. "But there might be something personal among them. You're looking for something, aren't you, Jane?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I'm always looking, Letitia. The smallest detail can unravel the largest knot." The library was a quiet haven, its shelves lined with well-worn volumes and the air thick with the scent of old paper. The librarian, Miss Weatherby, a prim woman with a penchant for order, greeted them warmly. When Miss Marple inquired about the Hargreaves donation, Miss Weatherby led them to a corner where a crate of books awaited sorting. "Mostly treatises on strategy," she said, "but there's a journal too. I haven't catalogued it yet. Thought it might be private." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face remained placid. "May I see it? I've an interest in the Major's time here." Miss Weatherby hesitated, then fetched a slim, leather-bound volume, its edges frayed but intact. "It's not much to look at," she said, handing it over, "but he wrote in it regularly." Settling at a reading table, Miss Marple opened the journal, its pages filled with the Major's precise, military script. Letitia peered over her shoulder, but Miss Marple barely noticed, her attention consumed by the words. The entries began with the fervour of a man newly married, Frederick Hargreaves besotted with Eleanor's beauty and charm. He described her laughter, her elegance, the way she transformed Wickham Hall into a place of warmth. But as the months progressed, the tone shifted. He noted Eleanor's growing restlessness, her habit of slipping out at night to walk the grounds alone. "She says it's the air she craves," he wrote, "but I see her linger by the well, as if waiting." Miss Marple's fingers paused on a page dated 3 months before his death. "Met a man in the orchard tonight," the Major wrote, "tall, with a soldier's bearing, though no uniform. He spoke to Eleanor in low tones too far for me to hear. When I asked her, she laughed it off, but her eyes were guarded. I fear she hides something." The entries grew darker, filled with unease. The final one, penned the night before his death, was stark. "The wine was bitter tonight, sharp like medicine. She watched me drink, her smile too bright. I've seen too much, I think. God help me." Miss Marple closed the journal, her mind alight with connections. The tall man in the orchard, the bitter wine, the Major's suspicions. They echoed the village gossip, the shadow she had seen by the well, and the schoolmistress's tale of Hargreaves's letter. Amos Finch, with his military frame and secretive habits, fit the description, but Miss Marple was cautious. Assumptions, she knew, were like poorly knitted stitches, easily unravelled. Letitia, wide-eyed, whispered, "Jane, this is chilling. Do you think Eleanor poisoned him?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "People's fears often reveal their truths, Letitia. But we need more than words on a page." Returning to Wickham Hall, Miss Marple resolved to test her suspicions. She enlisted the help of Inspector Craddock, a young policeman from Chipping Cleghorn, who respected her instincts. Over tea in the parlour, she shared her findings, omitting the journal's details but mentioning the shed and the nocturnal figure. Craddock, his face serious, agreed to investigate under the guise of a routine inquiry. "Mrs. Price won't like it," he said, "but I'll have a look at that shed." That afternoon, Craddock and 2 constables arrived. their presence drawing a sharp glance from Eleanor. She stood in the hall, her burgundy gown striking against the oak panelling, her composure fraying. "Is this necessary, Inspector?" she asked, her voice cool, but her hands clasped tightly. "Just a precaution, ma'am," Craddock replied, his tone polite but firm. "Reports of trespassers in the area." Miss Marple watched Eleanor closely, noting the flicker of alarm in her green eyes. The search began at the shed, its padlock yielding to Craddock's tools. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of earth and rust. Tools lined the walls, but Miss Marple's attention fixed on a trapdoor in the floor, its edges concealed by a pile of sacks. Craddock lifted it, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The constables fetched lanterns, and Miss Marple, ignoring Eleanor's protests, followed them down. The chamber below was small, its walls rough stone, its floor freshly turned earth. The air was foul, thick with the unmistakable stench of decay, masked imperfectly by lime. Craddock's men began to dig, their spades biting into the soil. Miss Marple stood back, her shawl drawn tight, her mind recalling a case of a missing tenant whose body was found in a similar cellar, buried to silence his knowledge. After a tense few minutes, a constable called out, and the lanterns revealed a shallow grave, its occupant a man, recently dead, his face unrecognizable, but his clothing suggesting a vagrant or labourer. Eleanor, summoned to the scene, gasped and swayed, her hand clutching the ladder for support. "I don't know him," she cried, her voice breaking. "This is monstrous!" Miss Marple observed her, noting the theatrical collapse, the too perfect tears. She recalled a village actress who feigned hysterics to divert suspicion, her performance crumbling under scrutiny. Eleanor's reaction, while convincing to some, rang false to Miss Marple's practised ear. Craddock, his face grim, ordered the body removed for examination. "We'll need to ask you some questions, Mrs. Price," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the constables worked, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the chamber, catching a glint in the dirt. A ring, simple but distinctive, half buried near the grave. She pointed it out to Craddock, who pocketed it for evidence. The ring, she thought, might belong to the victim, or to someone who had been here before. Her mind returned to the Major's journal, the bitter wine, the man in the orchard. The pieces were aligning, but the pattern was not yet complete. Back in the parlour, Eleanor sat pale and trembling, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, watched silently, her needles clicking like a metronome. The Major's journal had confirmed her suspicions, but the body in the shed raised new questions. Was this man another of Eleanor's victims, or a threat she had silenced? And where was Amos Finch, whose absence this morning was conspicuous? The shadow at midnight was growing clearer, and Miss Marple knew the truth was close, waiting to be pulled from the earth like a stubborn root. Chapter 7. The Widow's Facade. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes of Wickham Hall's parlour, casting long shadows that danced across the polished floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythmic click, but her sharp blue eyes were fixed on Eleanor Price. The widow stood by the fireplace, her burgundy gown a stark contrast to her pallor, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles gleamed white. The discovery of the body in the shed's hidden chamber had shaken the household, and Inspector Craddock's presence, along with his constables, lent an air of grim inevitability to the scene. Eleanor's composure, so carefully maintained, was fraying like a worn tapestry. and Miss Marple sensed the moment was ripe for truths to surface. Craddock, his notebook in hand, paced the room, his questions sharp but measured. "Mrs. Price," he began, his tone deceptively mild, "you claim no knowledge of the man found in your shed. Yet he was buried on your property, in a chamber accessible only through a locked door. Can you explain this?" Eleanor's eyes widened, her breath catching. "I told you, Inspector, I know nothing of it. Someone must have trespassed. Some vagrant or thief. The hall is old, with hidden places I've never explored." Her voice trembled, but there was a rehearsed quality to her distress, a note that struck Miss Marple as familiar. She recalled a village widow from years past, whose tearful denials masked a calculated crime, her performance undone by a single careless detail. Miss Marple's needles paused as she spoke, her voice gentle but probing. "It's curious, Mrs. Price, that such a chamber would go unnoticed. And the lime in the cellar, surely that wasn't for drainage, as you suggested." Eleanor's gaze darted to her, a flash of panic betraying her poise. I relied on Amos Finch for such matters. He handled the grounds, the supplies. If there was lime, he must have ordered it." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Finch, you say? Convenient, given he's nowhere to be found today. Any idea where he might be?" Eleanor shook her head, her handkerchief twisting in her hands. "He's a solitary man. Perhaps he's in the village or tending the far fields." Miss Marple's mind turned to the Major's journal, its chilling final entry about bitter wine and a tall man in the orchard. The villagers' gossip, the footprints by the well, the scratching in the shed, all pointed to Finch as the shadowy figure she had seen at midnight. Yet Eleanor's quickness to blame him suggested more than mere convenience. Miss Marple recalled a case of a deceitful heiress who shifted blame to a servant, only to be caught when her own lies unravelled. Patterns, she thought, were the key, and Eleanor's pattern was one of charm and deflection. Craddock's men had searched Finch's quarters, a small cottage on the estate's edge, and returned with a find that tightened the web. A bundle of letters, penned in Eleanor's elegant hand, promising Finch wealth and discretion for services rendered. The letters were vague but suggestive, hinting at tasks beyond gardening. One, dated a month before the Major's death, read, "Ensure it is deep and silent. Our future depends on it." Craddock read this aloud, his eyes fixed on Eleanor, whose face drained of colour. "Those could mean anything," she protested, her voice rising. "I wrote to Amos about the gardens, about planting. You're twisting my words." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. "Yet the Major wrote of a man in the orchard, Mrs. Price, a tall man, with a soldier's bearing, seen with you at night. And the wine he drank the night he died, it tasted bitter, he said." Eleanor's hands froze, her handkerchief falling to the floor. "Frederick was ill," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He imagined things. I loved him." Miss Marple's needles resumed their click, a steady counterpoint to the tension. She pieced together the threads. Eleanor's 3 husbands, each dead within a year, each leaving her wealthier. The grave-like patch by the well, the lime in the cellar, the body in the shed, a man who might have known too much. The Major's journal had confirmed her suspicions, but the letters to Finch suggested a partnership, a shared secret. She recalled a village scandal where a charming woman and her accomplice dispatched inconvenient suitors, their crimes hidden until a single letter betrayed them. Eleanor's facade was cracking, and Miss Marple intended to pry it open. Craddock, sensing the moment, pressed harder. "The man in the shed was no vagrant, Mrs. Price." The ring we found suggests he was someone known to you. And these letters, they speak of silence and depth. Were you silencing someone, perhaps?" Eleanor's composure shattered. She sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "It was Amos," she sobbed. "He did it all. He buried them to keep them quiet. I only wanted to be free." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her face remained serene. Eleanor's confession was too swift, too convenient, a performance designed to shift blame. She recalled the actress from her youth, whose tears were a shield until the evidence was undeniable. "Them?" Miss Marple asked softly. "You speak as if there were others." Eleanor froze, realizing her slip. Her eyes darted, to Craddock, then to the door, as if seeking escape. I meant the secrets," she stammered. "Amos was obsessed with me. He acted alone." Craddock's voice was firm. "We'll need to speak with Finch, and you'll remain here, Mrs. Price, until we do." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the ring found in the chamber, its simple design a clue yet to be placed. She suspected it belonged to the dead man, perhaps a suitor or a witness, silenced before he could speak. The letters tied Finch to Eleanor, but her quickness to betray him suggested she was the architect, not the pawn. Miss Marple knew that women like Eleanor, beautiful, cunning, practiced in charm, could bend others to their will. As a village girl, once bent a lover to commit her crimes. As Craddock prepared to search for Finch, Miss Marple requested a moment alone with Clara, the maid whose fear had lingered in her mind. In the kitchen, Clara stood by the sink, her hands trembling as she polished silver. "Clara," Miss Marple said gently, "you've seen something, haven't you? Something in the hall, or the grounds?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I heard them, ma'am," she whispered, "at night, in the shed, scratching like someone trying to get out. I told myself it was rats, but—" She broke off, her voice choked. Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "You've done well to tell me, Clara. The truth saves more than it harms." As Clara nodded, her fear palpable, Miss Marple's mind raced. The scratching in the shed, the buried man, Eleanor's letters, they painted a grim picture. Eleanor had lured men to their doom, using charm and poison, and Finch had buried the evidence, perhaps literally. The Major's bitter wine, the cliffside fall, the heart attack, all were pieces of a pattern, one Miss Marple had seen before in a woman who thrived on control. The widow's facade was crumbling, and the truth, like a buried seed, was breaking through the earth. Chapter 8. The Unravelled Thread. The twilight over Lower Wickham cast a sombre glow, painting the cobbled streets and the looming silhouette of Wickham Hall in shades of violet and grey. Inside the Bluebell tea room, Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table, her knitting needles clicking softly, a delicate counterpoint to the storm of revelations that had swept through the day. Letitia Blacklock, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and apprehension, sat opposite, her tea untouched. The discovery of the body in the shed's hidden chamber, Eleanor Price's tearful confession, and the damning letters found in Amos Finch's cottage had brought the mystery of Wickham Hall to a precipice. Yet Miss Marple knew that the final threads of the tapestry remained to be pulled, and she was determined to see the pattern complete. Inspector Craddock had acted swiftly after Eleanor's outburst. A search for Amos Finch, the elusive groundskeeper, was underway, and word had just reached the tea room that he had been apprehended at the edge of Lower Wickham, caught fleeing with a satchel stuffed with Eleanor's jewellery. emeralds and pearls that gleamed with the weight of her ill-gotten wealth. Craddock joined Miss Marple and Letitia, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had seen too much darkness in one day. "Finch is talking," he said, settling into a chair. "Says Mrs. Price ensnared him, promised him riches if he'd help her tidy up, as he put it." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes sharp. "And the body in the shed, Inspector? Has he shed light on that?" Craddock nodded grimly. "A drifter named Thomas Reed, known to the local pub. Finch claims Reed was courting Mrs. Price briefly, then turned blackmailer when he learned too much. Finch says she ordered him to deal with it." Letitia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jane, it's monstrous! Buried alive, like something from a Gothic novel." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was a whirl of connections. The ring found in the chamber, simple yet distinctive, had been identified as Reed's, a keepsake from a sister in a neighbouring village. The Major's journal, with its tale of bitter wine and a tall man in the orchard, aligned with Finch's soldierly frame and nocturnal habits. Eleanor's letters, with their veiled promises, confirmed her as the orchestrator, using charm and manipulation to bend Finch to her will. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth, a charismatic widow who persuaded a farmhand to dispose of her rivals, her beauty a weapon as deadly as any poison. The pattern was clear, but one question lingered. How many others lay buried in Wickham Hall's shadows? Craddock leaned forward, his voice low. "Finch insists he only dug the graves, Reed's and possibly others. Says Mrs. Price handled the earlier steps. Poison, he thinks, though he claims he never saw it done." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "Poison is subtle," she said softly. "It leaves no mark, only questions. The Major's wine, Julian Holt's fall, Reginald Vance's heart attack. Each could be natural, or not. Mrs. Price has a gift for appearances." Letitia shivered. "But why, Jane? She had wealth, beauty. Why risk it all?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Some people, Letitia, crave control more than comfort. To them, a threat, a husband who suspects, a suitor who demands, is a challenge to their power. Mrs. Price, I think, could not bear to be questioned." Craddock's men had searched the grounds further, guided by Finch's reluctant directions. Near the well, a second patch of earth, older and less obvious, yielded fragments of bone, too degraded for immediate identification, but suggesting another victim. The lime in the cellar, the deliveries noted by the villagers, pointed to a method. Poison to kill, burial to conceal, lime to erase. Miss Marple's mind turned to Clara, the maid, whose whispered fear of scratching in the shed now carried a chilling weight. Had Reed, still alive when buried, fought for air? The thought was grim, but Miss Marple had seen such cruelty before, in a village where a spurned lover buried his rival alive, believing the earth would keep his secret. Eleanor, confined to the hall under watch, was questioned again. Her tears had dried, replaced by a defiant tilt of her chin. "I was protecting myself," she insisted, her voice steady now. "Thomas Reed threatened me, demanded money. Amos acted on his own. I never told him to kill." Miss Marple, present at Craddock's request, watched silently. Eleanor's defiance was a new act, a shift from victim to survivor, but it rang as false as her earlier sobs. Miss Marple recalled a village girl who, cornered by evidence, spun a tale of self-defense, only to be undone by her own contradictions. "And your husbands, Mrs. Price?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Were they threats too?" Eleanor's eyes flashed, but she said nothing, her silence louder than words. Craddock pressed on, detailing the evidence, the letters, the journal, the lime, the bones. Each piece tightened the noose, and Eleanor's facade crumbled further. "I loved them," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. Finch, in custody, was more forthcoming. He described Eleanor's charm, her promises of a shared future, her instructions to dig deep and silent graves. "She said it was for our safety," he muttered, his weathered face etched with regret. "I believed her. God help me." Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the ring, the journal, the villagers' tales. Eleanor had woven a web of deception, luring men with her beauty, dispatching them when they became liabilities, and using Finch to bury the evidence, literally. The drifter Reed had been a mistake, his blackmail attempt exposing her method. The Major's suspicions, Julian's curiosity, Reginald's temper, each had threatened her control, and each had paid the ultimate price. Miss Marple saw the pattern clearly now, a tapestry of greed and manipulation, stitched with precision until a single thread, her own curiosity, began to pull it apart. As Craddock prepared to take Eleanor into custody, Miss Marple spoke with Clara, who had lingered in the hall's kitchen, her fear now mingled with relief. "I knew it was wrong," Clara whispered, "but I was afraid to speak. The noises in the shed, I'll never forget them." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've been brave, Clara. The truth is a heavy burden, but it lightens with sharing." Back at the tea room, as the village buzzed with the news of Eleanor's arrest, Letitia pressed Miss Marple for details. "How do you see it all, Jane? It's like you knew from the start." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "People are predictable, Letitia. They hide their secrets, but the threads always show. Through a letter, a look, a patch of earth. You only need to follow them." As they left the tea room, the stars emerging over Lower Wickham, Miss Marple's mind was already turning to her return to Chipping Cleghorn. The case was closed, the widow's facade shattered, but she knew other mysteries awaited. In every village, beneath the calm, lay threads waiting to be unravelled, and Miss Marple was ever ready to pick them up, her needles poised for the next stitch in the endless tapestry of human nature.